This is the Radio 6 International Network, broadcasting to Central Europe from the Rohrbach transmitters of Channel 292 and around the world online at radio6.com.
Around the clock, around the world.
A production of
Radio 6 International.
And now, live from the island of Lismore, it's Tony Currie.
The Tony Currie Show.
Radio 6 International started 60 years ago in my attic in the house that I lived in with my parents in Ardrossan on the Ayrshire coast. And I had been a lifelong radio fanatic. I think I got the bug when I was 4 years old. And by the time I was 11, I really wanted to run a radio station of some sort. So I got a bunch of school chums and some bits and pieces of equipment, including a microphone that was shoved into an old tin can and painted. And on a sunny day in June 1963, we launched our radio station. Well, I say radio station, we didn't actually have a transmitter, but we had wires that went downstairs to the living room, where my mother and my grandmother were bribed into listening to the first day's programmes because we gave them tea, and the girls involved in the radio station baked cakes. And it could have just been a little game that we played in the summer and then got packed away when the rain came on in the autumn, but it wasn't. It kept on broadcasting programmes now and again, and then more often. And then by 1967, I was so obsessed with it that we started daily programmes, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And that was quite a commitment for a schoolboy. But I had friends who were as excited about this as I was. And we kept on adding to this radio studio in the attic and adding new bits of equipment, building new pieces of equipment. And we connected a wire up to the Church of Scotland Eventide home next door. And that really was what started my career in radio and television, because I worked for Scottish Television as chief announcer. I worked for the BBC for 22 years as a radio and television announcer and producer and director. But through all that, my radio station, Radio 6, called Radio 6 because number 6 was the number of the house that we lived in. Radio 6 was always there. It was always in a studio somewhere. And when I moved to Glasgow, I built a little studio in the house. And when we moved house, I built a much bigger studio in the new house. And it was always there to experiment with and do things with. Until one night in the year 2000, my son Leo came home one day and said, "Dad, you've applied for lots of radio licenses that you never actually got, but you've got a beautiful radio station sitting doing nothing in the basement. Why don't we put it on the internet?" And since the year 2000, Radio 6 International now has listeners in 208 countries, and our programmes are rebroadcast by 31 other radio stations around the world. And we have a core audience of about 50,000 people listening every week. It's not there for making money, it's there for enjoyment. And my team of broadcasters, all of whom are professional broadcasters, many of whom have worked for the BBC, they all do it without fee, but they do it because of the love of radio. When I moved to Glasgow, I moved the radio station with me, and so I had the radio station in my flat. And then when I got married, we had the radio station based in the sun porch of the back of the house. And then we built a big house in Glasgow that was big enough to house the radio station in the basement. And we had 2 studios and a control room and a record library and an office. And that was really very grand. But unfortunately, my wife was unwell. She developed Parkinson's and arthritis and became wheelchair bound. And we couldn't get around the house in Glasgow. And we'd had a base on Lismore for 40 years, and we'd intended to build a house here for 40 years. So in 2019, we built the house, and in 2021, as soon as lockdown was over, we sold the house in Glasgow and moved here. And part of moving here was to cater for my wife's disability. Unfortunately, she died in January of this year. But part of it was that I wanted Radio 6 to have its own little house, its own premises. And it's absolutely superb. It's everything I need in one little room, but everything's here and everything works. And it's separate from the house. So there's a kind of psychological thing in the morning that I come out of the kitchen and walk across to the studio, and it's going to work in the morning. And I do, as soon as breakfast's over, first thing I do is I come in here and start working, because there's always stuff to be done. So it's an international radio station that happens to be based on the Isle of Lismore.